While I've always had the attitude that story is the most important thing and that the visuals don't matter that much, even I will admit that this mainly applies to anime from the last 20 to 25 years. I can easily watch shows from the mid-90s to early 2000s since I grew up on those. However, when I go back even further to the 80s, it becomes much harder. I often have difficulty becoming absorbed in older series because I often get distracted by the animation quality being significantly lower than what I'm used to. Because of this, it's rare that I get the urge to watch something from that time period. Although after seeing Macross Frontier and loving it, I had the desire to go back and check out the original Macross. When I first saw how it looked, I didn't think I'd even be able to make it to the end, but I was surprised at how quickly I became engrossed in it. There were multiple factors that contributed to this. In fact, I had so many good things to say about this show that the script wound up being the longest one I've ever written. So, hello and welcome to Anime Memories, and on this episode, I'm going to be talking about Super Dimension Fortress Macross. In the year 1999, a giant spaceship called the Macross crashes into Earth. It was technologically advanced beyond anything that humans were capable of at the time, which basically confirmed the existence of alien life. Over the next 10 years, the military put a ton of resources into repairing the Macross, and just as they were ready to launch, a giant race of humanoids known as the Zentradi becomes interested in the ship, and their curiosity eventually leads to them starting an all-out war with humanity. Shortly after the start of this war, the main character Hikaru joins the military after nearly losing his own life, as well as the life of a girl he likes named Minmay. Now, while I'll certainly get into praising this very shortly, in order to be thorough, I feel I have to cover a few criticisms I had as well. As you've probably already noticed from the clips I've used so far, the animation doesn't hold up at all. I'm not sure how this would have compared to similar shows of its time, but the movement looks incredibly stiff and jittery. I know it's somewhat unfair to criticise something that's 35 years old for having shoddy animation, but it's significantly detracted from my enjoyment, and I feel it could do the same to others if they don't temper their expectations. So if you're going to watch this, be prepared to look past some weird facial expressions and unnatural motion. Although I was actually surprised that other areas of the visuals still look really good. Whenever there was any kind of battle going on, it was very exciting. They were fast paced and the damage from the weapons looked devastating. Even though I knew where the story ended up, I still found myself getting worried when the characters were in a desperate situation. I think that this can be traced back to the great cinematography. The series uses a variety of shots and frequent cuts in order to keep the pacing of the fights quick, and this helps hide the flaws in the animation. Although there are a few times where they linger on a shot for too long and it can look pretty horrendous. The artwork is another aspect that didn't show its age as much as I thought it would. The backgrounds are detailed and look lively despite having colours that lack vibrance. The character designs though may be hit or miss depending on your perspective. They've got the distinct 80s look with poofier hairstyles, sharper facial features and smaller eyes. This may be off-putting if you're used to the sleekness of more modern anime, but I really like these designs. I could easily tell people apart, everybody's appearance matched their personality, and they looked appealing despite lacking a bit of polish. There's just one glaring problem with the cast that really stands out, and it's this motherfucker. In a medium that's known for wacky hair colours, this dude still manages to look dumber than everyone else. I know this was made in the era of glam metal, but this would have looked stupid even for the time. It's almost impossible to take anything this guy does seriously when he has fairy floss for hair. Overall though, I think the character designs provide everything they need to, and they do their job very well. Unfortunately, I wasn't as positive about the design of the ships. It seemed like every aspect I thought was interesting was cancelled out by another aspect that I thought was mediocre or just straight up ridiculous. For example, I really like the Zentradi battleships. Their dark green colour palette gives them a very intimidating presence. However, their crown units known as battle pods look like cheap knockoffs of AT-STs from Star Wars. The Macross suffers from this issue as well. It looks like one of the most badass space vessels ever invented, and the fact that it can take multiple forms makes it even better. But its shield system are these small circles that move around using a trackball like the ones from the Atari 5200 controllers. It has to be one of the worst forms of defense I've seen in any mecha show, and it made me groan every time they used it. Although when I took everything into account, the visuals were way better than I expected. While there were many times I had to ignore some less than stellar animation or silly design decisions, I came out of it pretty impressed with what the animes were able to achieve with the limited technology they would have had in the 80s. Now, the Macross franchise is known for having amazing soundtracks, and that reputation started here. There's an immense range of genres and each of them are performed and composed excellently. It obviously has a dramatic concert band and orchestral songs that you'd expect from a mecha anime. There's lots of trumpets, drumming and a variety of string instruments which fits perfectly with the epic scale of an intergalactic war. Rock is also pretty common. I would often hear an electric guitar in the background of most of the dogfights, and this further enhanced the excitement I felt during the battles. Then we have a number of pop songs, which is something that Macross is known for. There's some jazz, some blues, and one track with a xylophone and a triangle that I can only describe as psychedelic-ish. By the way, if you couldn't tell, I'm not exactly a music expert or anything. The guy who did the soundtrack for this must have been an absolute genius to create such a huge variety of songs. I'm not even that into music, and I found that every track at the very least was pleasant to listen to, with some even going into the realm of unforgettable. My Boyfriend's a Pilot was so catchy that I'll probably be able to recognise its melody decades from now. While the technical elements added significantly to the quality of this anime, in my opinion the story was the main thing that made this into one of the most revered mecha series of all time. What really sucked me in was that it doesn't take that long to get to some very intense drama. There was one episode early on where Hikaru and Minmay are stranded with little hope of rescue, and the most likely outcome for them is a slow death by starvation. As a kind of fulfillment of Minmay's last wishes, they have a pretend wedding ceremony before contemplating a double suicide. I knew it wasn't going to happen, otherwise the show would have been extremely short. However, it demonstrated that the narrative was not afraid to step into some very dark territory. I always respect a series that has the courage to put its characters through some intense physical and emotional trials. Although this series isn't completely glum, it does have a lot of light-hearted banter and there are characters in there specifically for comedy relief. There was one scene in the first episode between the female crew members where they were all taking jabs at each other, and it was pretty amusing. This helped even out the tone and meant that despite having a few heartbreaking moments, it would never become a drag to watch since there was always a bit of humour to lighten the mood. Ironically enough, a number of the heartbreaking moments I alluded to comes from one of my most hated cliches, the love triangle. I could go on for a long time about how much I despise these, but to simplify it a bit, I think the main reason why I dislike them is that many anime like to have their love triangle start either immediately or very early on, since they want to use it as the source of all the drama in the show. Before we even get a chance to know these characters, they're thrust right into the middle of a multi-way romance. It often seems forced, which in turn results in me caring less about the story and the people involved. What makes Macross different is that the writers allow the triangle to develop naturally. It starts off focusing on Hikaru's relationship with Minmay, and they don't bring the second girl Misa into it until much later on. The reason why a love triangle was put in here was that the creators thought it would improve the quality of the story, rather than just shoving it in there to appeal to people who like melodrama. While the leads certainly receive most of the growth, the anime manages to give the supporting cast a good amount of development as well. They were able to find an excellent balance with how they divided up the screen time. If they tried to give everyone their own side plot, it would have taken away from the arcs of the protagonists. However, if they only focused on the leads, I wouldn't have cared as much when the ship was getting attacked. So what we end up with is a crew that contains a lot of fairly one-note archetypes, but there's about a dozen of them that are compelling and have more than enough complexity to make up for that. Claudia is one of the supporting characters that benefited from this well-balanced development. Initially she didn't seem that important and I started thinking that she was just there because someone on the production team wanted an African American in their show for some reason. However, when there was a bit of downtime in the plot, they fleshed out her relationships with other people and gave her a very touching backstory. I love how the writers took someone who I perceived as a nobody and just by adding a small amount of substance to her personality and history, they turned her into one of my favourite characters. The best example I could give for how well the character development is done in this is Commander Global. He doesn't receive his own episode or any kind of specific arc. Instead, we get to learn more about him through observing his actions as climactic events in the plot take place. He's constantly having to make tough decisions, some of which are fairly cold-hearted and provoke scrutiny from his colleagues. However, he still goes ahead with his plans since, He's the leader. He's responsible for thousands of lives, and he's clearly taking that responsibility very seriously. Because of this, he evolves into a guy who has a kind heart and cares about his subordinates, but is willing to do whatever it takes to survive. I'm somewhat amazed that the series was able to make this guy as endearing as he is, without any kind of dedicated subplot. Although the most entertaining members of the cast for me were actually the Zentradi. They're a brutal race of people that have been fighting ever since they can remember. It's all they know. They've blown up multiple galaxies because defeating their enemies is the only thing that gives their lives purpose. This makes them an almost unbeatable threat. The only weaknesses they have are their lack of knowledge and closed-minded beliefs. As soon as they make contact with human culture, they become fascinated and horrified at the same time. When they see men and women interacting with each other on the same ship, they get confused since in Zentradi society this isn't allowed. There's also a scene where they intercept a broadcast of a swimsuit competition which they describe as weird and impractical soldier uniforms. Their biggest disconnect with humans is that they don't crave intimacy. In fact, they're actively repulsed by it. When they see two people kissing, they become unbelievably frightened since they believe that love nearly destroyed their race at one point in history. Their fear of emotional connections was very interesting, and I love how it was used as a vulnerability that gave humans a chance to survive that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Although despite their limited outlook on life, every member of the Zentradi army is still an individual with their own opinions on how to properly handle this war. Some prefer to charge in and try to overwhelm the opponent, while others like to take a strategic approach and think things through. They had so many wildly different personalities that the antagonists ended up being just as deep as the humans they were fighting against. These guys were fantastic villains, and this series wouldn't have been anywhere near as engrossing without them. While the visual quality of Macross may have faded a bit with age, the quality of its writing will last forever. It's iconic, and I'm sure that along with the original Gundam, it paved the way for many other mecha shows that were released in subsequent years. If you're able to look past how old it is, this is one of the greatest mecha anime ever made. It's so fantastic there's a good chance you'll enjoy it, even if you aren't usually a fan of the genre. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you have any feedback, please leave a comment, and if you want to see more, feel free to subscribe as well. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.